Welcome to our CreaTV Presents event for April. Today I am incredibly honored to be able to speak with Ellina Yin, Rosanna Alvarez, and Liz Gonzalez, who are all amazing, multi-talented people who are working to shape the landscapes of San Jose for the better. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce CreaTV San Jose and our speaker series, CreaTV Presents, which you have all joined us here today. CreaTV is a nonprofit community access center that serves the communities of San Jose by providing education, equipment, spaces, and platforms so that our communities can harness media as a way to create change. CreaTV Presents is our monthly speaker and event series where we invite community shapers to talk about their work in the present and their dreams for the future of the city of San Jose. I would also like to extend a big thank you to the Office of Cultural Affairs for sponsoring CreaTV Presents and giving us all the opportunity to gather here today. And again, happy first Saturday of spring to everyone. I hope everyone had a lovely spring equinox last week. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. The first part of today's event will be a facilitated conversation with our guests. Then we will open up for questions from the audience. I would also like to extend a big thank you to Malcolm and Caitlin. Malcolm is doing all of our Zoom tech for us today, so he's spotlighting and doing chat monitor stuff for us. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And Caitlin is helping us to live stream this event on our channel. So hello to everyone who is watching from their TVs at home, as well as live stream it on our YouTube channels. The music for today's show is provided by Ghost Rifter, Purple Cat, and Artificial Dot Music. The songs we've heard are Morning Routine by Ghost Rifter, Flourish by Purple Cat, Green Tea by Purple Cat, and our ending song will be So It Begins by Artificial Dot Music. Now I would love to introduce our first panelist for today. First up, we have Alina Yen. Alina Yen is a first-generation Cambodian American, born and raised in Eastside San Jose. They are a Multicultural Arts Leadership Institute alum from the School of Arts and Culture in San Jose. They are a nationally recognized Knight Foundation Emerging City Champion Fellow and a New Leaders Council Fellow. In 2020, Alina launched Only in San Jose, a civic education nonprofit which currently produces a civic education podcast and newsletter focused on the city of San Jose's constitutional convention that is happening now until November 8th, 2022. As a co-founder of arts nonprofit Local Color and a founding board member of advocacy nonprofit Catalyze SV, Alina is known as a passionate community organizer and activist that intentionally threads art and civic participation into all their endeavors. And Alina, I'd love to invite you up to say hi to our guests.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I'm really honored to be on this panel with all these amazing other people that are really have made a big impact on our community. And a few things that I forgot to mention is that I'm also the Director of Community Engagement at Code for San Jose, and I own and operate a consulting and creative studio and produce another podcast called Art in Motion, and we highlight creatives in the Bay Area that are working in the intersection of art and social justice, and really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina. All right, next up we have Rosanna. Rosanna Alvarez is the creator and host of the Hella Chingona podcast. She is a native Chicana of East San Jose, the firstborn of 9 siblings, a mother of 3 fierce guerreras, a trucker's wife, and a cultura-driven social entrepreneur. Her life's work is grounded in her mission to embrace personal power through creative inspiration. She is the creative force behind Citlali Rose, the co-founder of Eastside Magazine, and the voice of the Hella Chingona podcast. She remains forever in awe of the power of telling stories by us, for us, and about us, with heart in hand, ink to the page, always hollering truths. With that, I would like to invite Rosanna up to say hello to you all today.
Hi, folks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love that I'm here with Eastside representation. Thank you, Liz, for pointing that out. As Francesca said, I'm all about storytelling. And I was that little kid at the table with all of the tias who was all up in the chisme and just listening and watching, right? And there's something beautiful about being able to tell the stories of our grandmothers, the stories of our neighbors, the stories of the folks who sometimes are newsworthy for other reasons, to remind ourselves and ground ourselves. This is who we are. This is who we say we are. This is who we know we are. And so I love being in conversations with folks who are like-minded in that way. And I'm ready to roll. Thank you for having me. Oh, shout out Molly. Yes, class 9 right here. I always forget to put that in my bio because I feel like we live it. And we're always 2 degrees of separation from folks who have had a part of Multicultural Arts Leadership Institute in their journey. So, hey, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Finally, we have Liz. Liz Gonzalez is from East San Jose and a co-founder of Silicon Valley Debug, a community organizing and media collective. She is also a founding member of the South Bay Community Land Trust, dedicated to creating decommodified, permanently affordable housing. Witnessing the transformational power of storytelling is one of the most rewarding parts of being an editor and an organizer for Liz. Liz, can I invite you up to say hello to everyone today?
Thanks so much, Francesca, and thank you, like everyone has said, thanks for inviting me to this space with incredible women, just forging your own path in San Jose and changing what the future will be for our city. Super happy to be here. I'm an organizer and a media editor with Debug. Our foundation is storytelling and really reflecting on our world and dreaming up a new one together, like supporting each other's dreams. And part of that current work is starting the first community land trust in San Jose as a solution to this designed housing crisis, right? To take land and housing off the market so you can't sell it for profit, and that it can be used for its intended use of stabilizing people, of being a foundation of life so we can all thrive.
Thank you so much, Liz. All right, well, now I would like to invite everyone up. We're going to get started with our conversation. Thank you all so much for sharing all the incredible work that you're doing. And I would kind of like to get started by continuing to get to know you all a little bit more. I was wondering if you could kind of continue this conversation about your work, as well as just kind of introduce yourself in terms of like who you are and what was your journey to the work that you do now.
You going, Alina? I can wait.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just always think, people see what we do and what gets produced, and we forget that, we're people too. I don't forget. My kids remind me every day. My students humble me in a lot of ways too, right? Even though they're grown folk. And for me, I think it's important to remind people that there's a lot of beautiful imperfection leading up to this thing, right? And I know I have pretty visuals because that is how my storytelling kind of started, was through visual art. And so for me, the storytelling is multifaceted, and it's really anchored in my own journey for self-healing and my own journey of reclaiming and affirming parts of myself that I've always been told, keep it in the box, keep it contained, keep it polished, keep it this way, right? And so the visual art lets you do that without having the words, but I've always also had the words, right? Whether it be audio, hence the podcast, or written storytelling, which is why I write pretty much daily. And I think a lot of times I say I write to write myself, and that's a play on words spelled different ways. But how do you model that when you're in conversation with people? How do you remind folks that, to get here, I did have to accept certain failures in my life. Growing up, when I was like 5, I said I wanted to be a lawyer, a teacher, or I think a realtor like my dad. I've done 2. And then the third one that people really, or the first one that I listed, right? Everybody's like, yes, go to law school. And I was like, yeah, I love arguing with people. Let's go to law school. I love coming with receipts. That makes sense, right? Fits my personality. I went to law school, and I kind of failed and chose to fail in a lot of ways. while I was there, because that wasn't where I needed to be, right? And where I needed to be always feels like it's an uncontained kind of space. And storytelling allows you to access all of those different pockets of things that don't belong in a box. And so I tell my students and I tell folks, yeah, you want to go to law school and you want it? Great. We need folks, right? But I didn't have that little twinkle in my eye. For me, it was always about, well, what stories are the clients sharing with us when we're doing that volunteer work at law centers? What story is in this case, right, that I'm supposed to be really familiar with? And for me, it was, I want to know the stories there, and I want to know what conversation we can be in this process of educación that doesn't always look like formal education. And so my journey ended up being windy. And I think up until recently, right, I kind of was trying to figure out, well, where do I fit? What makes sense? And folks started calling me an artist, and it took me a while to accept that. And then it took me a while to really declare, you know what? I've always been a storyteller. I've had a blog, I've done visual art, but I've always been a storyteller. And I've always been curious about other people's stories. And so really what got me here was a lot of tripping over what I thought I was supposed to do and kind of settling into everything I've always been drawn to, right? And that's a little different. So I did want to make sure that I kind of declared that for other people who might be struggling, like, what do I do, right? Look at these phenomenal people, and I'm like, oh, I am so flawed, let me tell you. And I think that's one of the things in my podcast is I'm super transparent with my flaws. Even when I edit the magazine, I'm like, oh, girl, I cannot copy edit. I need help on that. I mean, I can, but my curiosity gets distracted by the story, right? And so I know my strength in that way, and really being able to take that out of a box and share it with people, I think is what got me here.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. I love how you kind of touched on how we grow into ourselves and we start to really feel what we've been doing kind of naturally and kind of let go of those shoulds. I know that I feel like I'm really in that process right now in my own life. I haven't quite gotten to letting go all of the shoulds, but it's definitely such an interesting process as we age and grow older and grow into ourselves. So thank you so much for sharing. Alina, I know you and Rosanna were kind of neck and neck there to go. Would you like to go next?
Thank you. Thank you, Rosanna, for sharing your story. I definitely followed a similar path, very windy. And my story started as Khmer was my first language, which is the language of Cambodia. And my parents and we learned English around the same time. And at some point, I became the interpreter. And that's kind of a familiar story that you might hear of a lot of non-English speakers and first-generation children. And so I always had 1 foot or 2 feet in two different worlds, and I was always trying to bridge different stories and cultural values. And so storytelling and interpretation was always kind of something that was innate to me. And I took that because when I was younger and like at that stage where like looking at the college books and you pick your discipline with no life experience, just pick what you're going to do. And didn't see anything in there that was really resonating or gave me that twinkle in my eye. And I picked marketing because it was storytelling, but for the corporate world. And so I thought it was a useful way to put my skills to use. I started in the design industry of the built environment. And so, I worked for construction and engineering firms that specialized in water and wastewater treatment. And then I went to architecture. And that firm, they worked on master and urban plans and hospitals and libraries. And particularly in architecture, I learned how cities were designed and, how companies like the tech companies that we're familiar with, like Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and how they completely changed the cities that they were, incorporated or born in, and do not pay their fair share in taxes or give back to the community as much as they should. And when I heard Google was coming to San Jose, I knew that, change was going to hit San Jose, and it has. And in that, I did a Google search, like, how did this happen? And I found out about the Planning Commission, and I had no idea what that was. And, just did some research. I got this book called The Real Estate State by Samuel Stein, and it took a deep dive into the Planning Commission and city planning. And then I found out about 29 other boards and commissions in the city of San Jose, and was looking into the legislative process and kind of how all of that worked, and that there was no education around it, and that there's 40 to 60 seats that are empty year round and increasing. And so decided to start a podcast. No podcasting experience, had no idea what I was doing, and I was sponsored by the Knight Foundation, so I was really fortunate. And then Molly really kind of helped me, what I would say was my recovery artist phase, because I used to write books and stories as a kid, and I didn't really fall back into that art until much later in life. And the podcasts, and now we're here, and that's the rest was history. And so now I'm very passionate about civic engagement, and I use my art and storytelling to really kind of thread those different areas together so that more people can be involved.
Thank you so much, Ellina. I was listening to your podcast in preparation for today, and I felt like I learned so much about the civic design of San Jose. So if anyone is interested in learning how to be more involved in local government, I highly recommend Ellina's podcast, Only in San Jose. And Liz, would you like to round out the question for us?
Yes, and thank you all for sharing. I really love to hear these backstories and get to know you more. And it's always a windy road. Same for me, you know, I'm not professionally trained in media production or writing, but I really love it. I grew up, you know, I'm first generation born to Mexican immigrants. We landed here in East San Jose, and I need to tell you this, that, you know, my mom and grandma addicted to going to garage sales. So every Saturday we were up early, like all the kids, and we would just go to garage sales. And I had no idea that the whole time we were going to garage sales in very nice places, it was still San Jose. And as a kid, you notice all those differences, or at least I did, like even when we would have to go into a Safeway or something, like the store was completely different. We were looked at up and down like we didn't belong there. And like, why is that, you know? And getting to travel back to Mexico during the summers, you just see that people live so different out there. And I'm public school educated, learning about El Movimiento in the 60s and the civil rights struggle. I was like, wow, I was born like in the wrong place, because in the wrong time, you know. Now I know we're just in the right place all the time, you know. God doesn't make any mistakes. But that learning about that really inspired me. And I got involved first with an organization called Californians for Justice, only because someone came to our class and the teacher was like, yo, extra credit if you do volunteer hours. I definitely needed it. But I was knocking on my neighbors' doors, like here down the block. I was standing in front of Tropicana Shopping Center, seeing my classmates and their parents come into the store. And so I really liked that I had the opportunity to change something right where I lived for my family, for my neighbors, you know, not some far away place, like where the work needs to be done is right here. And very soon after that, like I met the folks that would start Debug. And we shared the experience of working on high-tech assembly lines, like shoving together parts, not being able to talk to the person next to you, working with mainly like older immigrants, a lot of women, folks who didn't have the chance to continue their education because that job sucked the life out of you and required so much of you, and like killed so many of our folks because it is so toxic. And the protection there was for the product, like not for the people. So I don't really care for tech just like throwing around its weight and getting to dictate like what our future is. Like that belongs to the people. Like good ideas always come from the people. So we were telling the stories of what it was like to do that work in a place that outside folks think is the wealthiest place in the world, that it must be so great. And our lives weren't like that, right? We didn't have access to all that wealth that our families were creating. And we just grew from there, from telling the stories about that to having more conversations like Rosanna shared. You know, it became a place where folks who weren't supposed to be in the same room were in the same room having conversations about all kinds of things around life. And because also of who we were, you know, bad things happened to us, but we operated with this thing of we're stronger together. So if something happens to you, like, we got your back, you want to do something about it, let's do something about it. That's how we got into organizing. And folks mainly know us for the bulk of our work, which is around supporting families who have loved ones who are incarcerated or facing charges, and really walking with that family to become part of their loved one's defense, like really transformational work. Because we didn't set out to be just in organizing, right? We wanted just to have people follow their dreams. Like, mine was to be a psychic, astrologer, healer. I'm a little bit of those things some days of the week, you know, so it's just like supporting each other. And I see myself as an encourager, like, of others. Always a hater too, but mainly an encourager, right? It's okay to be critical, like there's a lot of things wrong that could be better, but let's work together to make it better. I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much, Liz. There's a ton of love for Debug in the chat, and Malcolm let us know that Liz used to do some guided meditations. Do you still do guided meditations, Liz? I'll give everyone a little insight. We were all just talking about how before this, Alina and I, we were meditating, doing some like nerve calming performance meditation. So maybe next time we'll have Liz lead us for that. Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. I think it's really powerful to hear how people kind of arrived in the present, because so often we only see people in the present, right? We don't get to see the whole winding story, and so often it is very windy, and you know, it just shows how multifaceted and beautiful like human life can be. So thank you all so much for sharing. I'd love to delve into our topic today, which is creating media for social change. And anytime I have conversations, I love to define the terms of what we're talking about. So I was wondering if we could spend some time talking about what is media to you and what is social change to you. So whoever feels inspired to take that on.
I can start us off. So to me, at its core, media is, you know, the means by which we tell stories that are happening at the moment or had happened. And, you know, this includes the radio, television, podcast, music, social media, the internet. And I think it's the most powerful tool that we have to create social change. There is a reason why 6 companies control 90% of media. And, you know, social change, sociologists, you know, they define social change as the human interactions and relationships that transform cultural and social institution. And to me, you know, being social is to be in relationship to someone or something. So social change is about when we change how we are in relationship to that someone or something. And, you know, we can look to examples like the civil rights movement that changed our relationship to who has rights and who doesn't. Or more recently, you know, the pandemic of changing the way we gather and the way we work to how we participate in public meetings. And I feel that change in relationship of how we relate to things is as natural as, you know, when you're a kid to when you're an adult and how you relate to your parents. You know, my parents don't tell me what to do so much anymore, but sometimes they're still a little bossy. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Alina. Rosanna and Liz, would you like to share either of your thoughts about media and social change?
Sure. Yeah, I immediately think, you know, how we define social change in a college classroom versus how we define social change as people in community. And so, without putting my professor Copilion too tightly here, I always start the conversation even with those folks. How do you define it? How do you experience it, right? And so when I think about media and when I was thinking about this question here in this space, I'm a sucker for context. And I think for me, media in a lot of ways is about power. And I felt this in my body. We went to Hearst Castle because my mom was like all about it. And I was like, fine, she's invited me 7 times. I've never gone with her. I'm going to go check it out. And I felt some kind of way in there that was not magical. I felt a lot of grief. I felt a lot about, stolen land came into play, how stories are shaped for the public in ways that guarantee continued access to power, resources, having a say in our, daily lives and how those are governed. And mind you, my windy journey, I studied political science. And I think when I think back to what I was trying to say, knowing that Spanish was my first language, and I would say I want to be an attorney, in Spanish you say quiero ser abogada, and that abogar means to advocate. And so for me, my media, I think, is a way of tipping the scales of power, recalibrating that for ourselves, and a way of building on advocacy, because we know that those stories have the capacity from the mainstream to be very damaging to our communities. And we know that there are traditional media channels that have been trying to address that. And we know that certain, newspapers and magazines and whatnot have tried to tip those scales by emerging, but there's resources involved. And so how do you shape that to be able to access those stories? How do you shape the trajectory of how we even define social justice in a college classroom? And more importantly, in the community, right? And so I always have to remind myself and my students and even my kids, because they hear these conversations and they always have questions, right? I have to remind myself, yes, we have these working definitions that are informed by these dynamics of power. And so the definitions that are held in those spaces of power, like the ivory tower, are largely informed by a legacy of systemic racism, right? And so am I saying the social justice mainstream definitions are wrong? No, I'm saying there are pieces missing to that story and how we get to access that. And I think media and storytelling has the capacity to remind people, hold up a mirror, hold up a window, hold up a door, whatever it is, right? In order for people to really think about what's affecting them on the daily, in order to really conceptualize for themselves, right? What do those inherent power dynamics feel like in your body? And what have we inherited and maybe can be more critical of, right? Like, I am a sucker for all media things related, and you look at the bottom of these things, like I came back from, they're going to shut us down right now. I came back from Hearst Castle and I was like, Hearst Media Corporation, Hearst Media Corporation, Hearst Media Corporation owns freaking everything. Good for them, right? But what does that mean for people who were displaced from their lands? What does that mean for people, right now suffering through gentrification in San Jose? What does that mean for stories like the one of my grandmother who, might not have made it to the news because someone else didn't think her story was worth telling, in the short term or in the long term. And so for me, engaging in that process, I think storytelling is inherently political. It's inherently a way of declaring that we do have power and that we do have this long-standing history of those stories being told in these marginalized spaces, right? And I say marginalized loosely because it's very intentional to leave us out and exclude us. And I think what I love, for as much as those dynamics of power and resourcing are still there and still do serve as active barriers, when we get to remind people things don't have to be perfect, right? Whether it's me rumbling on the podcast segments or me reminding a guest, you don't have to come polished and correct, right? You don't have to wear the blazer to this conversation. I want to know who you are as a person, because who you are isn't your work, right? You do your work because of who you are. That's a different kind of scenario. And then I think about how for the magazine, in the beginning, we struggled, right, for Eastside Magazine to get people to want to submit stories. And it's not that they didn't want to, it's that they learned somewhere that a story had to look and sound and read and be written in a particular way. So the first 2 years of our existence was us remembering, right, not even building relationships, because I think those relationships were already there because we were of this community, but reminding people, we have capacity to transcribe. Send us your audios through Facebook, give us a call and we'll take down the information, the story that you are carrying. And so I think for me, media is a way of kind of archiving, right? Like, yes, it tells a story in the here and now, but a lot of those things are archived in some capacity. And we need to be able to look back and access that, Because if I'm gone or Liz is gone or Alina's gone, right, and our podcast and our magazines and papers disappear, what clues have we left for the next generation so that they can look back in order for them to live in the here and now and feel like they can shape shift their own futures moving forward, right? So for me, it's all enmeshed and it's super political. And it's a little bit more complicated than the standard definitions that we're working with. And I think the beautiful thing about the way all the folks on this screen engage with media is that we get to determine what that media can look like and should look like, and is very much grounded in necessary change, right?
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Yeah, one thing that I found super impactful and like inspiring about all of your work, all three of you, is that you know, when I was doing research for this, at some point each one of you was like, I'm just a regular person, and like that kind of commitment to believing in everyone's voice and like the power that everyone's voice has, and the necessity and the importance of listening to everyone's voice, I thought was really, really powerful, and like just a beautiful thread that carried through all of your work. Liz, would you like to add your voice to our discussion of the what is media and what is social change?
Yeah, thank you. I love what folks shared, like hitting so many similar points. And I'll just add that also believe that media at its foundation is storytelling and anything that has a message, and it's just everywhere, and we have the power to create our own media. And because, you know, at Debug, we come from, you know, we were like not incubated, but we came out of that ethnic media news service that really focused on the voices that are not in mainstream, like folks who never get asked about the world, who never get asked their opinion. And suddenly you're in a room with like other reporters, with authors and writers of importance, and your voice has the same weight as theirs. Like that really set up how we operate as Debug, you know, like everyone should have a seat at the table. And those voices, we can insert ourselves into policymaking because they're so important. You know, there's such a disconnect from the decision makers and the people who, you know, we're just living our lives. So how can we do that more intentionally? Yeah, I just love everything that Rosanna shared.
Thank you so much, Liz. The next question that I would like to ask is kind of, how do you all see the current media and civic landscape of San Jose? Can you kind of describe what you're seeing today, and just kind of like what is it like right now for folks who might not be as tapped into media and the civics of San Jose? And Liz, would you like to start us off?
I will, and I'm going to be very honest and say I've also, you know, withdrawn my attention from media lately because it's overwhelming, you know. So I don't know if I'm that tapped in, because at least, and both of these, you know, there's much to be desired. We have some bright spots in the media in San Jose, and I have to lift up also ethnic media. We're such a diverse community, but, you know, we don't know, like of the radio stations and the small newspapers, many who have moved online, but those are really lifelines for our community and continue to exist because they've always, you know, been under-resourced. So it's not something new to our folks. But in terms of what folks are more aware of, you know, these are, news is supposed to keep tabs on the powerful, and we don't have very much of that in San Jose. Like our local newspaper very much protects the political class. Like we deserve so much better. So that's why it's even more important to, you know, to be our own news sources and to support the few that are out there doing good reporting, investigating, keeping tabs on things. Because someone needs to, otherwise the powerful just get more powerful. So we deserve a lot more in terms of that. And in civic engagement, you know, I'm in there too, but what are we engaging in? A lot of that process and like that system really we should just throw it away. Like, let's take the few good parts, but it belongs in the trash. Like, it's totally meant to exclude people, to keep us away from each other, to intentionally not know what the process is like and that everyone can be included. But it's not very friendly to like everyday folks who really like, we're working 3 jobs to survive here in San Jose. And I'm not going to ask someone to come to city council over their precious time that they get to spend with their family. So we need something completely new that is more like neighborhood based, like, you know, instead of encouraging us to be apart from each other and be afraid of our neighbor, like talk to our neighbors, do something block by block. We just deserve so much better than what has been, you know, presented to us, because the possibilities are really endless. And for folks down at City Hall, at least in my experience, they operate in a realm of possibilities that's this big, and we deserve so much better.
Thank you so much, Liz. Rosanna or Alina, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, on to the point where you said that you don't engage as much, Liz, because it's overwhelming, and that's 100% I think the case. We've been really hearing that a lot, even among my circle. It can be depressing because it's informing, but it's not really informing you what you can do about it. And it creates a lot of helpless situations. And in some of the research that I was looking at, and they said women are more likely to be upset and avoid the news. And it's noteworthy to show or to share that women and those that identify as LGBTQ or trans have a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, more than men and heterosexuals. And so when the news can be triggering, they're less likely to engage. And if they're less informed or less, they're not consuming the news as much, then it also leads to less likelihood of having the confidence to be really actively engaged civically. And so that is a whole problem. And the way we report the news and just the images that we're constantly, being flooded with is extremely traumatic. And it doesn't really do a service to our community. And in San Jose, I think it's getting a little bit better, but we still have a long way to go. And I know that for me, what I've noticed when San Jose Spotlight came, and they're a nonprofit news organization, and they don't have a paywall, and so I was able to access some different types of stories that, I don't have a subscription to the Silicon Valley Biz Journal or the San Jose Mercury News. And so that really kind of opened my eyes to different aspects of government. And I think that, they are starting to open up to the community and really kind of seeking out different types of stories. And so I think that's a good direction. Civically, I think since the summer of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter protests and the pandemic, they forced all the meetings to go virtual. And so I think we've seen a huge uptick in civic participation in local government and public meetings, and meetings going until midnight. People are turning up and they're really using their voice. And it's not a perfect system, because we deserve more than 2 minutes, and there should be a better way to run the meetings. But this is kind of part of the growing pains. And so I've seen people, especially the youth, I've seen a lot of participation of the youth. And I've been working with the youth in more civic education, in the media, and seeing people for the first time participate in what a city budget is, or the redistricting, and seeing a lot of people really request and desiring, ways to civically engage, because locally, I think you can make a much bigger difference than on a national level. And so I think we are trending towards, I'm a little bit of an optimist, towards a more civically engaged society, especially locally. And I think that's really important, because when I was in school in American government, our education stopped at the state level. We never learn what is the mayor, what is the city council member, what is the legislative process locally. That is not taught, and you can say maybe for a reason. And it's locally that we have the biggest impact to be able to write policy or participate and really be a part of that process. And there is a gap, and that's kind of why I started the podcast. It was really documenting my own personal journey of figuring all of this out, and then being able to broadcast that and share with people. And I had people tell me, like, because of this, I joined the redistricting, and they were a part of that process for the very first time, which is amazing. And so I think that people want to be involved, and they're looking for resources, and the resources are not there. And so there is a gap, and I think that, the city is starting to respond a little bit, but again, we're at the very beginning, and we've never really seen this before. And so I'm really excited for what the future may hold, and I'm all about providing the tools and resources to enable people to really live by their values and act by their values, and let them lead with their lived experiences and what the city should do. And so I'm really excited about the landscape of San Jose, particularly because San Jose is one of the largest cities in America, but we have this really small town vibe that I love. It's so accessible. I can't imagine doing what I'm doing here and having the impact if I lived in New York or like a much more metropolis city. And so I'm really thankful for the acceptance and the opportunity that I have here. And I really want to make sure before that changes that we're setting up the structures and really enabling the community to own our media platforms and the way that we tell our stories and inform our community.
Thank you so much, Ellina. Rosanna, do you have anything you would like to add to this discussion around the current media and civic landscapes of San Jose?
Sure. I think, you do see a lot of collaboration between the civic engagement landscape by traditional mainstream definition and collaboration with media. Like we saw it throughout the whole pandemic of people who had to show up and show out for a community, having those relationships with certain sub pockets of mainstream media to make sure that they were showing up and that this was being put on the news. Now, is it being spotlighted at the level that it could be in those mainstream systems? Probably not, right? We know like there are a bunch of tiered, complicated, but not that complicated ladders of power and whatnot in there. But without getting too far off on that tangent, I think I'm hopeful, right? I'm hopeful because it's like I know how much I've been impacted by the work that Debug does. I know how much I've been impacted by a growing number of folks who are like, you know what, I'm going to go for it. All you need to podcast is an ability to record some stuff. You don't even need the fancy microphone. I did this on my phone, right? I'm reminding people that there are different avenues to engage with that media, and that also civic engagement looks a whole diverse range of ways than what we've kind of been told it looks like, right? And I think that's a part of the struggle is that media, like Ellina said, it is triggering. Like Liz said, I don't want to engage with mainstream media right now. And I'm like, no, it's stressful. That high blood pressure situation, it's a real thing. And it's not because of the choices our communities make. It's about the never-ending, stress that we're having to field left and right, just to live. And I think about the media's responsibility in telling the story in a diverse range of ways so that we're not leaning on one particular narrative. And I know there's a lot of work to be done there. And then I know there's a lot of people doing that work, right? Reminding us that there are multiple perspectives to a story. And I think this is where it connects me back to Testimonio and Chisme, because you sit at the table and you know what happens when that one tia like dominates the story, and that's the one that everybody knows. And it might not be accurate, but it's not inaccurate, And kind of for me, media is that working analogy of it's dysfunctional, it's effective. The question is, what is it effective toward? And I think that depends on the person engaging with that, right? So when I do watch the news, my husband's more of a watching all the news channels, right? And for as much as people have assumptions about him and how he engages with media as a Mexican immigrant truck driver, right? He can tell you what's going on in the news. And I'm like, I'm going to find out from Facebook what's going on in the news because I cannot. right? But I have a 10-year-old in the house and she sits there and she'll watch and she stresses. And I'm like, she's 10. Does she need to be stressing over what's going on in the news? She wants to be informed, right? And so I think of her symbolically in some ways as our kids are watching. Our kids are watching the news. Our kids are seeing and hearing how we tell these stories. And if we can't change how those stories are being told in those easily accessible, visible spaces that are present in our homes every day, what can we do in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities to offset, the effects of that? And that doesn't mean you shelter them, because I don't shelter my kids. That means, how do we create an ongoing, accessible conversation that isn't just about my household? And I kind of think that's how I see all of these different media options, right? Recalibrating the effects of that, reminding us and grounding us in the full story, so that it's not just that one, channel or that one larger media corporation shaping everybody's reality, that we kind of pay attention to the more multifaceted story. And so I think in that way, I think the landscape of San Jose's media is a wide, varied, diverse, complicated, albeit hopeful art form of sorts, because art is politics too.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. You've all already kind of touched on this already just through, our conversation so far, but I was kind of curious, we've just discussed like what the current landscape is. I was kind of wondering, how do you think we can use media to create social change, to change these landscapes, to change the possibilities? And I know you're all already doing work that is changing those possibilities, so I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Like, how can we use media to create social change? I love seeing everyone's arm going to that gentle gesture of like, I'm going to unmute. Are you going to unmute?
I can start, and it is basically what we've already been saying, just including more voices. Because social change, hope we're doing it for good, but it could also be for not so good and for taking us backward. And so it's just, take a rest and then come back in. Currently, I am in that rest, I would say. But we need to come back in so that people see different perspectives. Like San Jose is huge, and people live very different realities and can totally never come to my reality or our reality over in East San Jose, like never have to see other people. And so they need to see that somehow. So we have a lot of different vehicles to do that, but it's just making space for other people to tell their stories and to share their dreams for the future and what could be new.
Thank you so much, Liz. Alina, I think maybe I saw you were also going for that unmute button. Would you like to go next?
Just building off what we have been discussing, and I'm thinking about, Rosanna sharing, stories about her grandmother, and I want to hear those stories. And I think, we can continue to use media to uplift and tell stories from different perspectives. And, a lot of us, we know facts don't change minds, stories do, because stories, they connect and thread all the facts and moments into something meaningful. And, there's a reason why the Bible has stories and not just the 10 Commandments. And I think what's momentous about this point in history that we're in is that storytelling has really been democratized. There's still a lot of barriers, but it's been democratized through social media and the internet, and people are desiring stories from different and diverse perspectives and cultural backgrounds. We can see that in movies that have been like box office hits that are in another language, and people thought that would never happen here in America. But I think people are really much more open-minded and desiring those stories from the historically, marginalized majority. I call them the M&M Club. And, we have the power to tell our own stories now, and we can toss the template. And I think the more we dial into the nuance of our lived experiences and those details, I think that's gold. I mean, that's why all of these companies are so damn nosy about our data, and they want, all of those specific details so that they can repackage that story and resell it to us. And for telling our stories, I think seeking out those alternative platforms, whether it's in podcasts or submitting it to Debug or submitting to Eastside Magazine. And one area that I've been kind of like thinking about when we were talking earlier about the archive, what are we going to leave behind? And if it's not us, who are writing these stories? And constitutionally, we have a right to petition government. And that petition can come in many forms. And there is no law that says you can't submit an audio or a written or a visual media. And so I think, it'd be interesting to submit stories and petitions just to the public record, because that is sealed and it's like managed by the library system and it's like forever in there. And to have, your story in the public record, I think that's an interesting way to begin archiving. And it's not the most perfect system for sorting through the stories, but I think the more our communities, demand that these stories are kept and, that somebody is responding to them, because as legislators, that's their job, is to listen. And if we're not, pushing the envelope and, pushing these stories and making it more of a priority, it's kind of ask and you shall receive. And so I think using media to create social change is one of the most powerful things that we can do right now, is to record our stories, put it on the internet, put it in the public record, and make sure that it's there. And so I'm going to pass it off to Rosanna now.
I don't know why I heard create media to create social shame, and I'm like, oh, there's that mishearing there. It's social change. I'm thinking, I really wish my brain were like straight line, linear, thoughts, but it kind of is like bursts of all of these things, and I feel like I have different ways to catch that story for myself. I think a lot of what comes up for me in this journey is thinking about who are we telling our stories to? And I think that's an important dynamic, because a lot of what mainstream media has asked in the past is for us to tell the story to a particular gaze, and it might not be the communities I'm trying to reach. And so I think the media that I engage in is intentional in a lot of ways, in that, could I write a grant for A, B, and C and make sure that my audience is going to look like this? I can, right? And you go to conferences, like once upon a time when I was figuring out what kind of storyteller I was, I thought I was a blogger, but I was like, no, I'm not a blogger. I'm a storyteller with a blog. And now I'm a storyteller that edits a magazine. I'm a storyteller that writes poems. I'm a storyteller that teaches. I'm a storyteller that talks a lot. And I'm a storyteller, right, that has a podcast, because I talk a lot to myself. And so for me, I think one of the epiphanies that I had on that journey in activating the podcast was that I almost didn't care if nobody was listening, because there was something powerful about me speaking the things in a way that I could access later. And so when I think about all of the different ways we can archive our story, my question is always, what can and does get, done with those stories later? Who's accessing them? Who even has a thought to access them in a particular space? And so for me, it's kind of like this ongoing relationship, a dialogue of sorts, right? And for me, the podcast is a way of kind of always being on the line. Like, you might not be able to call me on my phone because I don't answer. You got to text me first. But, I am kind of metaphorically available in that way to engage with my audience. And so people are like, well, there are certain things you can do to increase your audience size. And I'm like, but I don't want to, because I like creating intimate conversations. And if it organically reaches a broader audience later, then fine, I'll deal with that when that happens. But I feel like what other people would perceive as me holding back is me being deeply intentional about the way we engage with people that I can relate to on a one-on-one basis, because I haven't gotten to the scale on purpose where I lose that ability. And I think we see that in different ways, right? Like, we see that with mom and pop shops. Like, they could go viral and market certain products nationwide, but they want to be in a particular community because they're of that community. And so I think about those things, and I think about who we're telling our stories to, and that remembering that that's, if you are someone who's dabbling into media and storytelling and you have a very small audience that you're thinking about, my question is always, well, what does that do for that particular audience? What is the ripple effect of that impact that we're not measuring, right? And that we might not even care to measure. And I don't know if this is like residue from my nonprofit life and doing youth work, in places like Maxa in the past, but I always felt like when we were writing our grant narratives, we're like, who in the heck are we writing to? And these are not the stories in the way that we want to tell, right? And that's not media, but it is storytelling. And so in spaces that are considered media spaces, I'm still bringing that dynamic into the fold. I'm still thinking about, if my story reaches that one person who maybe was having a hard time, and that, somehow trickles way backward to me and I get to hear about that, that for me feels so much more valuable than saying I have 50,000, audience reach at any given, imprint with the hashtag or what have you. And so I think it's grounding yourself too in what is your intentionality behind certain forms of media, and what is that recalibrating in the bigger scheme of what media does for and with people. And I think to me that's a little bit, it's a little bit different, but I know it's relatable. And I think that's why I continue to share it, even after those big pauses I need to take, right, with myself.
Thank you all. Oh, go ahead, Liz. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rosanna. You get my brain going in all these like different directions too. And
I know.
It just reminded me of like how important it is just to do it for yourself and the process of it. And then maybe people see themselves reflected in that story for the first time. Like that was a really big deal for us at Debug initially, because, nobody was talking about the things that we were talking about, because it didn't have a value to the outside world, right? But to us, very valuable to be able to connect and relate with others and be like, even though we feel very alone, like we're not, like somebody is telling me, like reflecting back to me, my own life, like how beautiful is that? And those things we may never know, like we'll never know the impact of that, how beautiful. You just put it out there and let it go. And we're declaring that we were here, when the larger story is that we may have not existed, or that we loved like this hyper productivity, like slave away your life, hand over all your money to rent. Like, no, that wasn't us. Like we were here and we were living different, and we were exploring different paths. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate, doing it intentionally for yourself. And I know when I first started and I was talking to different supporters, they were very heavy on audience reach and, advertising and all of that stuff. And my podcast isn't for everybody. And also, I really wanted to be intentional with what I was producing. And then at the same time, one of the things that I was struggling with was reading into like the algorithms, like you have to post every week or else they'll rank your podcast lower. And I was thinking in 2020, I just did not have the capacity to produce every single week. And why was I setting up that expectation that we should be producing a story every week? Sometimes people there's always an overwhelm of so much information and so many stories. And I think if we, toss that template of like needing to produce so much at this time and whatnot, that we can produce much more intentional stories that people can sit with and think about. And I think that's so, so important. And so that was definitely something that I learned in 2020, was that my episodes are very sporadic and it's very reflective of just what I'm going through. And I think we've all had such a traumatic year in so many different ways. And if we don't acknowledge that and we just go back to normal, all of that repressed stress and emotion is just so terrible. And then we put out, the kind of this vision that it's okay to be like that, and it's definitely not. And so I think being more vulnerable about like, it's sporadic and you're going to get an episode when you get an episode, but I put a lot of time into each episode.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of that. I absolutely have kind of experienced similar thoughts around like this pressure to always be constantly producing. My background was in film and digital media, and for a while I felt like, oh, I need to be like producing stuff all the time, or like if I want to like become an artist, I need to produce all the time. Um, but in some ways, it's almost like what is the pressure? Like why are we producing all the time? What if there are times where I need to rest? You know, like Liz, like you were saying, like I need to rest to be able to come back into it. Like what is this pressure? And especially with the algorithms, like obviously there's so many other ways that, you know, algorithms are reflective just of social bias, since they are, you know, human created. But like why are we building this into our algorithms, which are impacting our ability to consume different, you know, media outlets so much? Like why are we organizing them this way? So I just really appreciate you all bringing that up, and also highlighting the importance of you as an individual person, and rest. I think that's really important when we're talking about creating social change, or creating something. That part of creation is resting. So I just want to thank you all for highlighting that. I think maybe this could be a good segue when we were meeting to talk about before we all came together today. Rosanna and Liz and Ellina and I and Malcolm also met, and we kind of talked over what topics do we want to talk about. And one topic that came up was trauma-informed reporting. So I was just kind of curious to get your thoughts. I know, like, with social media, I feel like awareness of mental health, and also like being trauma informed and having trauma informed practices, has become much more mainstream, and people are more familiar with it. Whereas I think, you know, 10 years ago, people were not as informed. I'm just curious to know, how can we start to incorporate more trauma-informed practices into our media creation? Do you have any ways that you're working on it? And what ways do you think that we could alter our practices to be more trauma-informed?
That's a big old question. That's a big old question. My mind immediately went to, I am a student. I'm a product of public schools, but then I ended up at a private university, and I had the weird experience, beautiful, of having had Dr. Sean Jinwright as my teacher. And like during the beginning of the pandemic, he was getting a lot of attention for his healing centered engagement work. And so when I hear trauma informed, I always think healing centered engagement. And I bring that into the mix because I think when we're thinking trauma informed, and how we engage in media and storytelling, I am approaching it from a healing centered engagement approach where, you know, I think for a long time, the stories about the East Side were kind of this weird trauma voyeurism. And I was like, look at this tragedy, look at this. And I'm like, yes, those things happen every day. And in spite of that, we are happy people, you know, like we're complicated. We're a robust kind of brew. And there's some strength there, right? And so I'm also not a fan of being like, we got to be resilient, but it's at the same time seeing the dynamics of people having had their stories told in a particular way, and seeing the very damaging effects of receiving those stories in a particular way, and always asking myself the question of, all other things equal, right, according to those narratives, what made my outcomes different? And I can't find a clear answer to that, because folks with all other things equal had markedly different outcomes, and similar, you know, great values in their home, and similar traumatic things that they experienced. And, you know, we might have been there for some of those stories that went down in the news. And, you know, I think about Debug, and I automatically think of, you know, Albert Covarrubias, who we went to high school together. And all other things equal, his story should have been different, right? And maybe what happened in his life wasn't a result of what media was saying. But I also don't know, right? I don't know if the kids who pick up, you know, a different kind of life have absorbed what the media has told them about themselves. And so I think for me, when it comes to the podcast, when it comes to the magazine, when it gets to the root of, for me, this feels like deeply personal work, right? For me, it feels like, how can we offer up and create spaces within that media structure and its complications to remind folks that our stories are complicated and multi-layered, multifaceted, and there is no singular narrative for who we're supposed to be in the world. And so I think about those healing-centered engagement strategies in working with folks to encourage them to tell their stories, because I think there's also, for me at least, yeah, I like telling stories. I like telling my story because I know my story best, right? And I think it's the same thing when it comes to community. I can tell an interpretation of their story, or I can create a culture within the spaces that I have some authority in shaping to really do right by allowing people to feel like they can step up and tell their story directly. And I might be able to shape a lens, right, to receive that, an approach and a relationship. And really, I think what I'm saying is accountability and some responsibility to do that so that people feel like I can come and talk about these things. And I can come and talk about these things that might be deeply traumatic. And guess what? I have jokes about it because that's how we've had to survive, right? Which is very different from being told or invited to tell your story from this perspective of trauma voyeurism and not allowing folks to tap into the full range of their humanity, right? And reminding folks that you don't have to feel some kind of way, right, when you experience A, B, or C situations that might be deeply traumatic. The human response is complicated. You know, how many times have I been shushed in a library or in a hospital room or at a funeral because my, humor reflex to deal with traumatic stress is just ridiculous, right? And I think about how many people are not telling their stories on traditional media channels because it doesn't sound the same unless we call them comedians, and then it's okay, right? And so for me, it's bring that full robust brew of your life, your traumas and your joys, and how can we kind of spotlight those alongside each other. And I think the challenge then is we're so drawn to the sparkly that it's hard to talk about those difficult things. But I think that's also part of trauma informed and healing centered, is that you also got to respect when people don't want to talk about those things and what layers of it they might be willing to share, right? And I think that that's different. There is an accountability there. So I think for me, immediately what comes to mind is relationships, accountability, and how you reciprocate vulnerability. And I think a lot of folks don't have that figured out, because we're drawn to people's vulnerability on display. We're drawn to clicking on things that are deeply traumatic, and we are not, doing our job mainstream wise of following up, right? Following up. Those stories will go viral, those videos will go viral of all of these tragic things happening. But do we have then, the follow up of, well, how's the mom doing now? Not unless it's a sensational, phenomenal story, right? It has to be sensational, it has to be phenomenal. And I think there is a whole range of regular people with a regular response that I still think is worth telling, right? Like, I want to hear. So now I have boring days, and this is what I do with my boring days, and I'm like, but there's still life there, right? And I think that sometimes is missing from traditional media. And I think is the enormous capacity of folks who are valued with their communities and how we show up. It's like this distinction, right, between educación and education. There is a way to approach community that doesn't feel like you're putting them on display.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you for all of that. And thank you for, lifting up Albert's name. I know the chat's not going to get reflected everywhere, so just wanted to say that out loud too. And, when I saw this question, like the only language that I have for it is like non-exploitative, right? And that's the approach that we also try to take at Debug, and that we have taken, because everyone's a storyteller, but not everyone's deserving of our stories, and so to have all that in mind, like it's definitely based on relationship and is a person willing to share, like maybe you can get something in conversation, and that's as far as it will go. and that has tremendous value too in building trust and like being with people over years and years, because the more traditional is like, what's going to get the biggest hits, what are people going to click on, but then forget about, and like people are still in that same like space with all of that pain and nobody around them, and like that's not the community that we want. um that's what comes up for me with that question.
Yes, and I think Rosanna really picked up the point about there's no follow-up. And I think one thing that's really missing is we say trauma-informed, but we're not really talking about trauma. We're not talking about how long it takes to heal from trauma. And when people go through a traumatic experience, interviewing the day of, the day after is so inappropriate, and it's so re-triggering. And we see the way news and media covers trauma is the same as it's been that I've seen my whole entire life. And that is what needs to change. And there should be follow-up in people who survive all sorts of tragedies. And, how did you heal? How long did it take you to heal? And these stories can help inform when we're writing legislation to protect survivors and protect victims. Without those stories of the lived experience of surviving it and healing from it, those legislations are always going to fall short. They've fallen short for a really long time. And I think it is a very difficult topic to talk about. And we do tend to shy away from it. And humor is just a really fantastic way of dealing with it. And it should be allowed, but so should getting upset and crying. And really being vulnerable and just feeling the trauma of what has happened to your community and the place that you grew up in or somebody that you knew. And without those stories and without the true impact of trauma and violence that we face in our community that are tied back to so many different types of legislations that enable those situations in the first place, what I see that's missing is we don't tie back to legislation, which sounds like really boring or, nuanced, but the people that are suffering trauma and find themselves, in these really violent situations or unfortunate situations is not their fault. We designed a world through the laws that we write that created these systems of homelessness and mental illness and gun violence. And when we don't connect it back to how we got here, we tend to focus on the individual as being at fault for, whatever has happened to them. And that is completely false. And it's really damaging. And so I think, the more that we can center different ways of talking about trauma and how it really impacts our community deeply, and just following up, coming back to a person if they should choose to share their story 1 to 2 years later, because sometimes, that's how long it takes to just be able to talk about it without, having it be overwhelming. There's so much more that we can do. And I think trauma education and just, talking about that first might be a really good step for a lot of local media, people who have the agency and autonomy to bring up these different types of conversations.
I'm hearing. I feel like even me, when I started talking, right, I kind of focus on audience engagement in some ways, but I think let me find my words. This is why I can also do visual art, because sometimes I'm like, the words are jumbled. But part of that trauma-informed care with which you tell a story also starts with how do you even ask about the story, right? And I think, how many times have you maybe had a microphone, metaphorically or otherwise, shoved in your face, like, hey, tell me about this, and you're like, what in the hell kind of ask was that, right? And it's appalling. And the thing is that we almost applaud the audacity of people to do that. And I think part of maybe how we do media is also that responsibility of approaching folks from testimonio kind of as a working methodology, but of the people, where it's like you do have this ongoing relationship and therefore ongoing accountability to this community. So you can't just show up with your microphone and be like, hey, yo, so there was a shooting here. Tell me what's up. You know, you have to approach it with care, and you have to also center yourself in your experience, and I think the more familiar, and you have to check yourself, the more familiar you are with what somebody might be experiencing in those traumatic moments, I think the tendency is, unless you've been broken by the system and applauded for your audacity to do some appalling things, you tend to approach that story differently. You tend to seek out that story in a very different way. And I've had, experiences where we're an hour into a podcast conversation, and yeah, I go back and I edit and splice, not to change what the person is saying, but sometimes, all the filler, I gotta take it out. People have a certain attention span. I know I do. But I think with even those, sometimes I'll be an hour in and there are so many great things, and we'll hit this part in the conversation, and the person is so trusting of me holding their story that they forget that we're recording. And so we'll get through another 20 minutes and they'll be like, whoa, I really opened up all these vulnerable layers. You know what? I'm not comfortable having that out there. I own my story. I think we need to talk about these traumatic things, but I am not comfortable with what comes next after you hit the publish button on that segment. And for me, I could be like sleazy as heck and be like, well, it's already there. You signed the release, whatever. But I don't, right? Because it's the responsible thing to do, is to allow that person to say, I am no longer comfortable sharing this, right? While they may still have valued the conversation, to really think about certain things and articulate those and speak truth to power in that way. Yeah, that was an hour and a half of my time. And you know what? That's fine, right? That story is there. You want me to delete it? I can. You want me to hold it, right, in confidentiality, and you tell me what comes next? Fine, that's part of my approach too, right? So I think honoring the layers of vulnerability in even holding the story and being a person who's trusted with the stories and soliciting these stories, it's going to look very different from what you may be taught in a mainstream communications approach.
Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on that. I love how you all kind of, over this course of this conversation, have brought up kind of these the power that's in storytelling, but in kind of this dual kind of way, right? Like storytelling shapes our world and shapes our understanding of the world. Like we both shape and are shaped by stories. And then on the other hand, as people who are facilitating stories, the power that we have to affect someone else's life with their own story, and how to be like mindful of that and how to approach that in like a caring way, because it is such a gift when someone shares their story with us, and like how can we honor them and make sure that they're being taken care of. So thank you all so much for talking through that and offering all of your beautiful thoughts on it. And I also want to acknowledge that it is a real like hard and heavy topic to talk about. So I think I would like to just take a little pause and kind of ask you all, like, is there anything that you want to bring up right now after that? Or is there anything that would help you feel like centered after that sort of heavy question?
I think it's this moment of silence just to kind of sit with it, because yeah, I definitely felt myself getting emotional talking about it, and having time to just breathe and let that emotion pass is really important, and not suppressing it. And so thank you for this conversation, and being such a welcoming space, and that we even get to talk about this, because yeah, this is not mainstream, and I think it's a really important topic. And so thank you, Francesca, for just pointing out that little rest period.
Absolutely. I was starting to feel it too as I was listening to you all talk, because I think when we talk about trauma, we automatically kind of reflect on our own lives and the lives of the people around us. And so I think it does, as humans, it brings it just brings up all the feelings within us. And I think sometimes there can be a lot of pressure of like, oh, we're doing like an event, so we need to like keep going and present in a certain way. But it's also important to kind of like model these ways that we want to kind of see the world move, which you have all been talking about this whole time, like the ways that you are actually modeling the things that you want to see in the world. And Rosanna, I think I cut you off. I saw your little mic come off.
It did come off. But I was like, I'm gonna linger in some deep breaths, and I put my feet on the ground. I can barely reach I'm short, so it's like my feet are always swinging on a chair. And I was like, let me adjust my feet and ground myself, and really think about storytelling as a legacy, a tradition of our peoples, and diverse globally. I think it's ours, and ours in all capital letters. And when we were taking that pause, that breath, I kept thinking our stories have consequence. Um, and I think about that when we're talking about trauma informed, healing centered. And they have consequence in beautiful ways, and they have consequences, right, for some people in very tangible, very real, very targeted ways. And so, for as much as we took a breath, I think I'm also going to take a segment afterward and just write some things out, right? Because it doesn't matter. Nobody ever sees my chicken scratch journal. There's something about declaring it true, like Liz said, right? And our stories have consequence.
Thank you so much for that, Rosanna. Alina, did you just come off mute or were you off mute?
Oh, I just came off.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was always off mute, so I'm good. I'm just taking a breather.
Yeah, let's go ahead and just let's just all take a minute. Everyone in the audience as well. Do some sort of grounding. I'm gonna take a couple breaths and some sips of water, and then I will transition. I'm gonna ask maybe one more question. We have an audience question that we'll move on to after that. But yeah, let's just take a moment to kind of like breathe and recenter ourselves in the moment, or in the present moment. Okay, I think the question that I would like to kind of wrap up this facilitated conversation on, before we move on to some audience questions, is what are your hopes for the future of San Jose? And I want to ask this in a very broad way. So it could be media related, but it could also be, whatever hopes that you have that you would like to share about the future of San Jose and our communities here.
Okay, I'll start. I am hopeful for this one. Because I imagine a future San Jose, where everyone is thriving and where each part of the city has self-determination to shape their neighborhoods, how they live their lives, where corporations are not dictating what happens in our city and getting their way all the time, where we have entire neighborhoods that are resident community controlled under a community land trust, and folks have, a full life of being creators, of having time to rest, to enjoy with friends and family that not everyone gets right now. And where we're using, our imagination, our wildest imagination for good, to have like a city that we don't even, we won't even recognize. And we don't have a jail. We do not have any jails. I have to put that in there too. We're not incarcerating our folks. We have plenty of resources for prevention to lift each other up, so that those things aren't a part of our society.
Thank you so much, Liz, for sharing that beautiful vision for San Jose. Rosanna or Alina, would you like to add anything to that vision of the future?
Yeah, I am very hopeful about the future, and I think after 2020 and the amount of turnout we had in our elections that year. Soon after that, though, we saw, was it like over 400 bills with provisions to restrict voting introduced in 49 states. But fact is, after 2020, also at the same time, the city of San Jose formed their Charter Review Commission, which I like, their Constitutional Review Commission. And from that commission that worked all year long last year, they came up with 18 recommendations. And, that ranges from adding a land acknowledgement to our city constitution, to climate action, to having the entire constitution include gender inclusive language. And, we're looking at ranked choice voting, and we're looking at housing, we're looking at police reforms, and we're also looking at removing citizenship requirements to boards and commission. And then there was a bonus by Council Member Arenas and Carrasco to remove citizenship requirement for and expand voting for all people in San Jose that live in San Jose. And I think that is incredible. And our city charter hasn't been looked at since 1986. And that group of people that looked back then, they made one or two recommendations, and it was about timing of mayoral elections. And you can see, like, almost 35, 36 years later, like, these are the recommendations that are coming forth. So I think we're having our own movement in San Jose, and you don't see that reported right now. And I think it's important that it's a shame that this isn't talked about, but I think this is a tremendous moment in our history. I've been told that there's no way that council is going to add 18 ballot recommendations because it will confuse voters, which I think is really ridiculous, because just even in the naturalization and citizenship process, it's a big quiz. It's a long, long document. I think people are smart. They can figure it out. And my hope is that all 19 of these recommendations make it to the ballot, and that we'll be deciding a different type of future for San Jose. And council will be talking about this on April 11th and April 29th, and they're going to decide next month which one of these 19 recommendations are going to go on the ballot. And I think that it is just phenomenal that a city as large as San Jose is talking about all of these items. It would definitely be a historic moment for our city, and it could set an example for the rest of America of what happens when we come together. And I participated in these meetings the whole entire year, called in. I spoke for 2 minutes at a time about land acknowledgements, about gender inclusive language, and the commissioners are San Jose residents, and they listened to us and they invited us to speak. I did a presentation, and I have never really felt more heard in the process. And so I think, it's a very important place this is the one place that we have to come in and work with other residents and our council members and city staff to really co-create different types of solutions. And it's beyond voting, because we're not reacting to what's presented to us. We're presenting what we want to be talking about and what we want to happen in our city. And I'm really, really excited about this year, and I hope that COPA is further sponsored, and we have the Community Land Trust. There's so many different pieces, so many different individuals, like everybody here, that's working to really create this change. And I'd say I equate public meetings to watching the fine print. It's really, really hard to get through sometimes, but it's one of the most reliable sources, because they are under oath, and I don't pay attention to what they say afterwards as much, because it doesn't matter. What matters is what they say when they're on the record, when they're on, under oath, and the actual legislations that they're passing. And so this is the most important time, I think, for us to all really gather and march and protest and really make our voice heard, that we want these recommendations and we want these types of changes now.
Alina, we have a question in the chat about what the dates of the council meetings where the initiatives will be discussed again.
April 11th and April 29th. They're at kind of inaccessible hours, but I can share with you the details, and we can probably send them out post.
Perfect. Yeah, I had the same thought in mind. I'll after this session for everyone in the audience, I'll get the details from Alina and I'll send it out to you. So keep an eye out in your inbox for further follow-up stuff regarding the city charter. Rosanna, would you like to add to this beautiful future of San Jose that is being woven right in front of our eyes?
For sure. I think having had the experience of being displaced when the first kind of housing crash happened, I have been a gentrification refugee for a hot minute now, and I have children who I didn't get to raise in San Jose, and in some ways that breaks my heart, especially when I have an opportunity to reflect on what that meant for me and what that means for me and what that continues to mean for them, right? But in reflection, I always think back to an interview we did, and they asked me to distill what it was like growing up on the east side. And I was like, how do you do that? It's like the smell of pan dulce. You know it when you feel it and you vibe with it. It's really hard to distill and capture in words. And I just kept thinking that whole time, well, the east side is home and the east side will always be home. And in Spanish, right? Aquí siempre tendrás tu casa, right? Aquí siempre será tu casa. Like, this will always be your home in a lot of ways. And I feel that, it doesn't go away. It's so much my home that it kind of anchors me in its media and in all the businesses, even if I try not to. But I think about how my kids, when we go back to the east side, they feel that, right? They know what panaderias we went to growing up. They get to go there. Those places, thankfully, are still in existence, but increasingly under attack. And so when I think about, San Jose and my vision for it, I want it to retain a lot of its flavor, a lot of its nuance, a lot of its diversity, a lot of its heart. And I think the heart is constantly under attack, right? And you look at the growing cityscape, and does that look the way our families need it to look? And I don't know that it does, but it's what we have to work with. And what I know about growing up in San Jose and Eastside in particular is that we are resourceful as hell in working with what we've got. And so when I think about a vibrant San Jose, right, because for me it must be a vibrant, diverse, thriving space. Not just for the folks who can afford the inaccessible pricing, but it has to be livable and thrivable for everybody. And so I see my kids still being able to go back and feel that sense of home that they've been able to tap into for now. I see families thriving. I see conversations that have been shaped, by some of the folks that I featured on the podcast, but also I think it speaks to the essence of what we try to do with Eastside Magazine, and it's to constantly ground ourselves in who the heck we are. And so for me, a thriving San Jose that's vibrant, diverse, with heart has to honor everybody's voices equally. And there may be some things that we can't change, but damn it if I could change them, I think part of that vision would be how do we get some justice and equity really, 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 truly embedded in the fabric of the city. And that doesn't mean you trickle down a little tiny portion of what, people who can afford to live anywhere are willing to give, but it means like, how can we justly, rightfully, equally, equitably really start paying attention to a different possibility, right? Because everybody uses that visual, and it drives me nuts because it's that visual of the kids trying to see the baseball game, and then they're like, look, if you put them on here, if you take away the fence, and I'm like, why are we watching the game? Why are we watching the game? What if my kids just want to play on the damn grass? All right, so for me, when I think about San Jose and what could it look like, I think about how I don't want it to look too, right? And the experience we had in holding space for folks in Gilroy, and that's that the stories didn't matter unless they were coming from, people that were seen with some kind of importance. That you hear stories from kids saying, I grew up here, I was born here, and I want to belong, but this place doesn't want me. So I know damn well that that's not what I want for San Jose, right? I want for the kids to grow up there, who are born there, who managed to survive and thrive there. I want them to feel that sense of belonging. I want the elders to feel like the community cares about their stories. I want to be able to show up to a space and know that folks are familiar with how beautifully robust, flawed, imperfect we are, right? And that we're much more than just our job titles or whatever it is that's being featured on the screen today. And so the San Jose I envision, I see glimpses of, and I'm thankful for the folks who work not just within the systems for systemic change, but through all the channels that are required to create true social change. And I think part of that vision is also a space where they get to rest too. Because how many of the people that are doing that work are always tired, always talking about being burnt out, always tapping my shoulder, be like, can you guide us in a self-care workshop? So in some ways, you know, I imagine a San Jose where, as much as I love to facilitate those workshops, where I don't have to, because people are able to do it because it's a part of the culture of the place, instead of something you got to figure out how to steal and creatively tap into. And so I see it being a continued sense of home and belonging in multilingual spaces that are accessible for everybody, right? Including our folks who we take for granted our ability to walk, we take for granted our ability to hear, we take for granted our ability to use the restroom, right? Because we assume that everybody has those abilities, and the reality is it's not the case for a large part of our community. I imagine a space where I don't have to exit on Story Road and see people getting creative with tents and encampments, but that they've been taken care of by being allowed to take care of themselves, right? So I see a vibrant, thriving space where the arts is at the center, where our stories are valued and people belong.
Thank you so much, Rosanna, and thank you, Liz, and thank you, Ellina. I think that was a really beautiful vision of San Jose, and I can't wait to see it unfold in front of us. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I would like to transition us into the Q&A section. We do have a question already in the Q&A. Again, if anyone has questions, you can type them in the Q&A, or you can also type them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat as well. So our question is from Donna. Donna says, for me, it is super important to hear stories from people who speak other languages other than English, and who live in communities that are marginalized. How can you not only encourage these people to tell their stories in their mother languages, and how can these stories be translated into multiple languages to make them accessible to many people from many communities?
I can speak to that, because if I don't, Omar from the magazine will be like, yo, and I'm like, I know, it was right there, I was just waiting. But Eastside Magazine, we intentionally set it up to be free and in print, right? At a time when folks were like, why are you going to print and digital? Like, just stick to digital. That's where the times are going. And we were like, you know, there's something about being able to pick up a thing that's tangible and accessible and free that, you know, with the realities of where we are with digital segregation, got to be mindful of. So we built that in as part of the intentionality of the magazine, and it's bilingual in Spanish and English, mostly because demographically, right, it's a numbers situation, a resource situation for now. The hope is that we'll continue to collaborate with other folks with other languages, and we do encourage code switching even when an article isn't fully in another language. And so we have seen folks from the Vietnamese population, the Cambodian population, the Filipino population step in and code switch some of their language, and that does something, right? Even if you're accessing the story in English, because that's what's there, to see your language on print in the page. The hope will be, right, as we can get additional translators, that maybe we can do that, or partner with other orgs that can bilingually tackle that from a space where the nuance, right, matters. So for sure, I think that continuing to offer in different languages, continuing to encourage the welcoming cues of all of those languages, even when you can't tackle them in their entirety. For the podcast, I code switch into Spanish all the time, which is not exactly on point for the question, but I think it's also important because we have heard from monolingual Spanish speakers, right, that maybe you just catch a listen by way of whoever's listening in the kitchen that day or wherever it is people are hearing the podcast in their cars, that there's something about hearing certain words in Spanish that they're like, oh, I don't know what the whole interview is about, but I want to know, right? And so I think that's about signifying, right? Those signifiers that you put out there for people, those markers of belonging. And even if you can't tackle the whole thing in itself, it's a step and an encouragement in that direction. And we know that with the magazine, we are tackling that intentionally, and that there's also always room to continue to learn and grow and encourage other people to step into the fold too and tell their stories in multilingual ways.
Yeah, for the podcast, we're working right now to have it translated into Spanish and Vietnamese, and so that's forthcoming. I think that people are definitely much more open to hearing stories in different languages because it's a different feel, it's a different tone, and it's really important that we familiarize ourselves with these different cultures because then we begin to humanize and destabilize that othering. And I would say some of the barriers that exist right now is just the infrastructure of finding quality translation services, but also there is a lot of quality translation and interpreting people who are completely capable, but they're outside of the traditional educational or certification program. And so I think it's up to institutions and foundations to really kind of uplift these multilingual programs and provide that infrastructure as well so it can be easier. And yeah, I think I know I'm working on a few art projects that's going to come out in Khmer, and it was sponsored by Santa Clara County. And so I'm really excited to put that project together. It should be hopefully in June. But I think, Donna, that's a great question. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot more multilingual content coming up in the next few years.
Liz, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share on that one?
Just to open up space with folks that we already know and encourage them, like Rosanna said, with what we got, start with what we got, but we also have, some offices locally that we can advocate with because it is so important to be welcoming, to be inclusive, to learn from everyone that makes up San Jose. And we've been working on the next Debug magazine for quite a while now. We've always had the dream of being trilingual and have just never gotten there. We would love to be also in Vietnamese. Maybe that's in our future. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Liz, Alina, and Rosanna. If there's any lingering questions in the audience, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I would like to ask all three of you. I know that I felt super just inspired and enlivened by our conversation today, and I'm sure that our audience has as well. And I'm sure they're all wondering, where can we find you? How can we follow you and your work? I'm sure they want to know how they can keep in touch and see your work evolve over time. So where can people find you or your work, online or anything like that? And Rosanna, we can go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, the easiest because I'm so wildly compartmentalized to a fault, even though everything overlaps and I'm multifaceted. But in my brain, it's like this goes here and that goes there and that goes there. So I park everything on my link tree, and it makes it easy for folks to connect. You can find me on Instagram at SeriouslyRosanna, RosannaAlvarez.com, the Hella Chingona podcast, So the easiest way is always to go to the link tree and find yourself the right links to the right little piece of the language you speak in your artistry, right? As I think we talked about language in the traditional sense, but I think some of us also have that visual language and that storytelling in audio form language and that writing it down in terms of written language. And so you can find me on the link tree, make it real easy, no misspellings if you just copy and paste that link, because that's the favorite pitfall is folks spelling my name 50 different ways, and I love them all, but it's right there, Rosanna Alvarez, and I'll connect with you LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, whatever your language is, whatever compartment jives with you, it's all there.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Ellina, would you like to share how people can find you?
Yes, I also put it in the chat, but on Instagram and Twitter, I am only in SJ. And the website, the same name, onlyinsj.org. And the podcast, Only in San Jose. You can find that in all major platforms.
And Liz?
Thank you. I also put that in the chat. Our website is SiliconValleyDebug.org, and putting links to the Instagram, Twitter, and also the Community Land Trust Instagram, South Bay CLT.
All right, everyone. Donna, yes, I can send you the chat. I'll send it out after we wrap up this session. I want to thank Ellina and Liz and Rosanna so much for joining us today. This was an incredible conversation. We're getting a ton of love in the chat right now for all of you, and I'm sure we're getting even more from our viewers who are watching at home on the TV, I guess, because we're all probably at home right now. But for our viewers who are watching on our channels and on YouTube, I know that they're probably also feeling super inspired. But thank you everyone so much for joining us today. If you want to know more about CreaTV, if you liked our event, you can find us online at creatvsj.org. And let's see, do I have anything else that I want to say before we wrap up? I don't think so. I just want to again, thank you to Ellina, thank you to Liz, thank you to Rosanna. You can find their links in the chat to follow them. Their work is incredible. I highly recommend following all of them. Thank you so much to Malcolm and Caitlin for doing all of the tech today and helping everything go super smoothly. We could not have done it without you. Thank you again to the Office of Cultural Affairs for sponsoring this and giving us this space to be able to come together and have these important conversations. Thank you to all of the people who made our wonderful lo-fi beats, and thank you for putting them online under Creative Commons licenses. And with that, I wish everyone a happy spring day, and I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday. And thank you so much for joining us.